Hi, everybody. Welcome to the fourth day of the Vanier College Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I am Marlene Grossman. I am a psychology teacher at the college, and also I coordinate the symposium along with the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Barbara Perry is a professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University and the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. She has written extensively on hate crime. She is currently working in the areas of anti-Muslim violence, anti-Semitic hate crime, the community impacts of hate crime, and right-wing extremism in Canada. She is regularly called upon by policymakers, practitioners, and local, national, and international media as an expert on hate crime and right-wing extremism. Dr. Perry, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Marlene, for inviting me back again. I've been with you once before. Always good to be a part of this event. So important. And I think, of all years in recent history, this is maybe one of the most important years to have the sorts of conversations you're having here, given the rise of anti-Semitism across Canada and the US as well. Yeah, good to be here. What I want to do, as the title suggests, is look at some of the signs of hate as they are currently emerging in the Canadian context. So looking at hate crime, at the normalization of hate, and at the role that that hate groups play in enhancing or creating this environment that is so dangerous for so many communities. So the starting point for me is really to talk about the extent to which hate, hostility towards a whole array of communities has become normalized in recent years. Has really become part of our everyday experience, our everyday climate. That there is increasing permission to express negative perceptions of, again, a number of different groups. And I think that here in Canada, we like to lay the blame firmly at the feet of Donald Trump, who during his campaign for leadership, first of the Republican Party and then for the presidency of the US, really, I think, sort of came with guns blazing on the scene in terms of the extent to which, as a political leader, he shared such horrific images and narratives about a number of different groups. So he vilified Muslims and Mexicans, immigrants generally. You'll remember shortly after he assumed power, he implemented a immigration ban, an entry ban on Muslims, people coming from Muslim majority countries, attempted to ban, people who identified as trans from the military. So, a pretty wide swath of the community. And that, has filtered in here, right? Because much of that was on social media, and the social media borders are very porous, right? We read the same tweets as Americans do. So it has affected us as well in the way that we respond to these groups. But a lot of that also predated Trump. And we've seen it amongst politicians in our own country, and certainly in the province of Quebec, as you're probably more familiar with than I am. Harper, during the last, not the last election, second last election, referred to the niqab as offensive. Even prior to that, he talked about Islamization of the West as the greatest threat to Canada. Leach, again, during that election and then subsequent to the election when she was running for leadership, really touted this notion of screening for Canadian values when newcomers were coming to our country. And then more recently, and this was on the anniversary of the murders of 6 Muslim men outside Quebec City, Legault said, "I don't think there's Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there should be a day dedicated to Islamophobia." So to be able to deny Islamophobia in that sort of context, I think is also, a way of deflecting the the seriousness of the issue. We've also seen not just narratives coming from mainstream politicians, but we've also seen an increase in candidacies amongst far right activists. So what you see here, first you see Maxime Bernier, the leader now of the People's Party of Canada, who when he first created that party became a magnet for members of the far right who were drawn to his anti-immigrant stance in particular, and his resistance to multiculturalism and diversity. So it seemed to be sort of an appropriate place for them, an appropriate party for them to throw their support behind. I think also you may or may not be familiar with the fact that Faith Goldie, who at the time was sort of the golden girl of the far right in Canada, also ran for mayor of Toronto, one of the most diverse cities in the country, and garnered around 25,000 votes altogether in the GTA, in the Greater Toronto area. About 40,000 votes went to people who were running on explicitly far right and often racist, horrifically racist platforms. So I think that's a worrying trend, and certainly Ontario wasn't alone. Toronto wasn't alone in that. We've seen similar patterns across the country, both at the provincial level and at the municipal level as well. And that trickles down. And I think that trickle down effect is seen in some of the poll results that I'm sharing with you here. So the first one I think is really telling and suggests 33% of respondents feel freer to publicly express views of other races, ethnicities. So there's a recognition, and the next two as well, right, about feeling that prejudice has become more acceptable. There is a sense that it has in fact become normal, it has become acceptable, it's become palatable to not just hold, but to express various kinds of prejudice and bias. So again, it's sort of been fed by some of the political rhetoric, as well as some of the online, I'm sure you've talked already this week about online patterns of hate and hostility. That is certainly fed into this as well. If we look at some of the other variables that were tapped here, there's increasing opposition to current immigration patterns. And in particular, I think these last two are really worrying. 41% of those surveyed felt there were too many visible minorities immigrating to Canada. And 37% felt that immigration was a threat to white Canadians. I mean, that is taken directly from the playbooks of some of the far right groups that are so visible in the Canadian context. So it's not just a political narrative. It's not just a narrative associated with the far right, but some of these attitudes, some of these sentiments are actually playing out amongst the broader public. And I think we see that most dramatically in the hate crime data. So this was the latest data we have is for 2018. It'll probably be another couple of months before we have data for 2019 and another year before we see 2020. But you see here that, keep in mind, we've only been reporting these data since about 2009, a little bit earlier than that. So it's not a very long period of time to observe patterns, where there's increases, decreases over time. It's fairly steady, right, between 1,000 and 1,500 until 2016. So the increase from 2016 to 2017 is 47% in police reported hate crimes. That's a really dramatic increase in any category of crime. And in fact, if we'd seen that increase in any other class, headed, from, violence against women to, assault to arsons, we'd have called for a national inquiry. It would have been considered a national crisis. Yet there was relative silence on this really dramatic increase. And I think that says something again about that normalization, that we don't have the political will to intervene there. There was a slight decrease in 2018, but down 13%, but you can still see it's above historical levels. And we have every reason to believe from what we're seeing anecdotally and from other organizations that collect data, National Council of Canadian Muslims, for example, or B'nai B'rith, every reason to believe that there are going to be increases again in 2019 and 2020, and especially in the context of COVID, where we've seen it appears upticks in anti-Semitic and anti-Asian sentiment as well as violence. So watch for those data. Just to break that down a little bit, what you see here is that the bulk of those offenses were general mischief, which is, fairly low level. This is vandalism and graffiti, those sorts of things. But I don't think we should dismiss them just because it's at the lower level. Certainly shouldn't be dismissed. Because when you think about these are very public acts, right? Vandalism, which includes very often, swastikas or graffiti, or graffiti that says "go home," or graffiti that says "kill all gays," or something like that. That is really impactful on the community as a whole. It's not targeted toward just one individual. It is intended to send the message to the whole community. You don't belong here. You're not welcome here. You're not valued. So I think that we really have to take that very seriously. And it can also escalate, right? These sorts of behaviors can escalate into what we see as, the second and third most common, uttering threats and common assault, which are not at the lower level necessarily, right? Especially uttering threats. That's intimidation, right? That can really instill a dramatic sense of fear in targeted individuals and targeted communities as well. If we look at the distribution in terms of motivation, this is fairly constant over time, and it's fairly constant across space as well, in that most Western countries show very similar distributions. That is, race or ethnicity tends to be most common, followed by religious motivation, followed by violence motivated by sexual orientation. To break that down a little further, when we look at race and ethnicity, it is in fact the Black community that is most likely to be targets of hate crime. And it's quite, what falls away quite dramatically after that. Looking at religion, and I think, we have to sort of put the two together, I think, religion and race in many respects, because if you look at the numbers of South Asian and Arab and West Asian, amongst the general population, there's often an elision between race and religion when we're talking about Muslim communities in particular, right? People who are thought to be Middle Eastern or South Asian or Arab are often then also presumed to be, rightly or wrongly, presumed to be Muslims. So difficult to say. And we don't record multiple motivations, which I think would be, really important and really interesting to see to what extent that really is the case. Nonetheless, consistently and over time and over space, anti-Semitic behavior is the most common, is the most frequent, followed by anti-Muslim sentiment. You can see, again, in 2017, when we had that dramatic increase, that a lot of that is accounted for by an increase in anti-Muslim violence. That was a 151% increase year to year. So again, an incredibly dramatic leap over time, over just 1 year. I want to turn now to sort of the next level. We're thinking about this as a continuum from the narratives, the dangerous narratives we saw at the beginning, to hate crime, to now look at extreme right or far right violence and how that plays out as a manifestation of hostility towards particular groups. In the study that we released in 2015, the National Study of Right-Wing Extremism, just from 1980 to 2015, we identified over 120 incidents of violence associated with the far right in the Canadian context. And just to sort of put that in a different sort of context, during that same period of time, we could only identify 8 incidents of Islamist-inspired violence, yet that is where the focus has been in terms of policy, in terms of law enforcement and intelligence activity. So, a mismatch there in many respects. And just to put a finer point on it, If we think about the last 5 or 6 years, and this is just looking at mass homicides, not individual homicides. In the incidents of mass homicide that we've seen in this period of time, 19 homicides can be attributed to some variant, some thread of the far right. In 2014, Justine Bork killed 3 RCMP officers in Moncton, inspired by an anti-state and very much a far right ideology. Bissonnette, of course, murdered 6 Muslim men in Quebec City. Again, influenced by anti-Islamophobia, far-right narratives, anti-immigrant narratives associated with political leaders. He was a great follower and great fan of Trump, for example, and Marine Le Pen of France. So again, an influence there. And then more recently, Alec Manassian, of course, killed 10 people in downtown Toronto in his van attack. And he has been identified and self-identified as a member of Incel, which is, I'm sure you know, involuntarily celibate, a misogynistic arm of the movement. And I think it's important to note that misogyny, patriarchy has always been at the heart of the far right movement. You can't keep the white race safe and pure without controlling our women. And so that is, it's important to acknowledge that as part of the far right movement as well. There's been a dramatic growth during that same period of time that we saw a growth in hate crime and hateful rhetoric. There's also been a dramatic growth in the far right. So these were the data or this was the map we created at the end of that 2015 report. So just over 100 active groups across the country. And you can see where the concentrations are: Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta in particular. Much of the concentration has remained the same, but the numbers have increased quite dramatically. So we're estimating now probably closer to 300 active groups across the country. So new groups that have emerged since 2015, 2016, and new chapters of groups that were already on the ground when we were doing our work in 2013, 2014. So again, a fairly dramatic growth. We're also seeing some other worrying trends, I think, in the makeup of the far right. That is, there's been quite a considerable demographic shift. So there's quantitative changes, right? More of them, but also qualitative changes. So the movement now, and you think about, when you think about the far right movement, I think you probably think of, a youth-led movement, 18 to 24. And, that describes still some elements of the movement: skinheads, the traditional neo-Nazi groups, that sort of thing. But in groups like Yellow Vesters, amongst those who identify as part of the alt-right, which still has that same thread of nationalism and exclusion, we're seeing a much older demographic. So middle-aged and older, as you see here in this image. People who are better educated, college and university degrees, people coming to the movement, and people who are gainfully employed. That is, with good, middle class, working class, and white collar jobs as often as blue collar jobs, which is, a real shift in recent years. We're also seeing more coalition building, which is also worrying, right? This building up of solidarity and a show of increased force or power, if you will, amongst the groups. So when we're doing our work in 2013, 2014, there wasn't a lot of coalition building across groups. There was a lot of infighting within groups, and there was a lot of infighting across groups as well. They were not playing together. But after 2015, after 2016, and the Trump election especially, we saw much more coming together of the groups online. So a lot of online strategizing between them, but offline as well. So here we see some images on the left of a rally. On the right, this was at sort of a mass at one of the border points where irregular migrants were coming across. So you see here Lamut and Storm Alliance coming together, other groups. And over here, same sort of thing. You see 2 or 3 different groups coming together in the rallies. pardon me. So rather than protests or demonstrations sponsored and people populated by a particular group, we're now seeing multiple groups coming together, often with groups like the Three Percenters, who I'll talk about in a moment, providing security, as they would call it, at these demonstrations. One of the other pieces that we're seeing that is especially worrying is the growth and emergence and growth of the accelerationist movement. And for probably the last year and a half or so, they've been, these sorts of groups have been very visible in the US context, and are just beginning probably in the last 6 months or so to really have a strong presence in the Canadian context. The base, and these are amongst the most extreme groups. Their intent is to foment conflict and violence between groups, between sort of the far right and their opponents, to increase the likelihood of some form of civil war, whether it's all-out civil war or whether it is a racial holy war. They don't really care. They just want to foment that kind of division. So you might remember just a while back, maybe 2 years now, this is when we first probably heard about the base in Canada, where Patrick Matthews, who was a member of the CAF, the Armed Forces Reservist in Manitoba, was actually found to be recruiting for the base in that province. And so again, that was sort of one of the first indications that they were here. And in the last few months, we've seen more attempts at creating chapters of one of these more extreme groups in the Canadian context. The last trend I want to focus on is probably, and I apologize for the language here, but that's what's out there. That is, parts of the far right, elements of the far right, are increasingly armed and dangerous. And there's a number of things that account for that. I mean, the movement as a whole is becoming much more blatant, much more militant in its narratives and its visibility. But these sorts of elements, like the Three Percenters, which styles itself after an American militia group, is dangerous on a number of fronts. This and other groups, Lamut is another example, that claims to have membership from former and active military and law enforcement personnel. Lamut, in fact, was founded by two former military personnel. And so what we're seeing is, on the one hand, some of the groups are encouraging their members to at least enlist with the reservists so that they get the training that they think will facilitate their organizing and their strategizing. We're also seeing recruitment within the armed services that like Patrick Matthews, right, is trying to bring others into the fold. And then we're seeing at the exit, after exiting the military, people are being recruited or are gravitating for some reason towards far right groups. So they've got the training. Groups like this, like the Three Percenters, are heavily armed, with automatic and with semi-automatic weapons. We've seen lots of images on their websites of caches of very heavy artillery in preparation, like the accelerationists, in preparation for that final conflict that they're certain is coming. So you have the arms, you have the training to use them, and then you have that xenophobia, as this slide suggests, right? The Islamophobia in particular, although they are racist and xenophobic in many other ways as well. So these, I think, are some of the trends that we really need to watch out for. And I just want to close by drawing attention to the implications of COVID for patterns of hate and hostility. So in the context of COVID, of course, we've seen a lot of scapegoating. We've seen the development and the dissemination of a whole array of conspiracy theories, including QAnon conspiracy theories. And here, this is again, coming back to Trump, it's almost like coming full circle now. Trump's insistence on calling, COVID, the Chinese virus. Some of his advisors referred to it as the Kung flu. So very demeaning ways and derogating ways to label the pandemic. And so we've seen in the context of these conspiracy theories, leveling blame, not just at Asians, which, has been very common, right? It's a bioweapon created on purpose. But we've also seen increased anti-Semitic activity or anti-Semitic sentiment informing these conspiracies. So if it's not Asians, it's the Jews who are responsible for the pandemic. Some argue that it's, they're in collusion with Asians. Others say that it's because they're going to come up with, or they have already in their pockets, the vaccine that will then earn them filthy lucre. So these conspiracy theories are really widespread and entering the mainstream, not just at the extremes anymore. It's entering the mainstream as well, which has contributed to dramatic increases of online activity in terms of attempts to vilify Asians, in particular, as these images show, but also increased anti-Semitic activity online. And as I say, when we see the data, hate crime data from 2019 to 2020, no doubt we will see upticks in both anti-Jewish and anti-Asian violence there. We're already getting some sense of that from community-based organizations. So the COVID has become the sort of a way to legitimate ongoing negativity towards these groups and negative behaviors as well. I think it's important that, that's also sort of put into the broader context, the broader climate, and is one of the things that when you think about, I mentioned earlier on the yellow vesters, for example, that was a case where a very legitimate set of concerns around, the threats to the oil industry and the energy sector in particular became co-opted by the far right, and who inserted then racial narratives into those complaints. I think we see much the same in the context of COVID, right, where there has been incredible economic dislocation. You see here, millions of jobs lost. Some of them will never come back. Businesses have been lost. Some of them will never come back. And so that's created real economic anxiety, which makes those conspiracy theories so much more appealing. And then add to that also the social dislocation, right? The social anxiety we're feeling about not being able to connect with family and friends as we come up on the holiday season. We're in this second wave where, many of us may not be able to see our families at Christmas time, and certainly not our extended families. And so that creates a remarkable amount of anxiety as well. As this sort of image on the left shows, there is an increase in mental health issues across the board, right? People who are showing signs of anxiety and depression, and again, factors that may make people vulnerable to some of these conspiracies and acting out on them as well. So what do we do? I mean, there's so many points of entry here. This is just a scatter shot of potential opportunities. So one is, demanding political leadership. This week, I was fortunate enough to be with a number of allies in this battle, meeting with the Prime Minister for an hour on one night this week, all blends together, meeting with the Prime Minister, as well as the Minister of Public Safety, the Minister for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Secretary for the Minister of Justice, and making a case for enhanced response, whether that means, enforcing the legislation that exists or creating new legislation intended to respond to not just hate groups, but hate crime and hate speech, hateful narratives as well. We do now have something like a national action plan on racism and discrimination, which seems to should provide the at least the framework, the context, or the pretext under which to exercise that political leadership and institute the sorts of change that we have been asking for. I think these sorts of forums, these sorts of very public forums around hate and around right-wing extremism, the whole array of problems are really important for increasing awareness, because I think one of the issues that that is a challenge in terms of making change is the lack of recognition of how extensive and how impactful hate in its many guises can be for affected communities. We don't recognize how divisive it is. We don't recognize how much, for some communities, it results in a withdrawal away from, sort of social engagement with others. So very problematic. Among those interventions in terms of regulation, whether that's formal or informal regulation, we absolutely have to address online hate. That is the foundation. That is the starting point for so many of the other issues that we have that I've addressed here in the presentation. And I think a big part of that, and something that perhaps is happening at Vanier, and I know it's, we're trying to make it happen here at Ontario Tech, is enhancing critical digital literacy, especially in the context of this burgeoning of not just misinformation but disinformation, purposely deceitful information that is shared and circulated in the context of the conspiracy theories, for example. And that's really important to intervene at that point for both youth and for adults who are, buying into this. So really important that we create mechanisms by which we can help people to learn to think about both the messaging and the source and the intent of the messaging as well, to reflect very critically on what it is that they're consuming as users online. So those are sort of the takeaway points that I'll hope you consider, and to what extent you can, provide your own pressure on local, provincial, and federal policymakers to help us to make change in this context. So I thank you for your time, and happy to engage now in some conversation and question and answer.
So thank you so much for that very thorough presentation, highlighting how hate is just increasing on all avenues. So my question is really, I'm going to stay right now on the online hate part of it, just because students tend to spend so much time online. How do you feel about imposing restrictions to companies like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tall order. It's absolutely a tall order, and but I think it is important. They have been slow to respond. Every time they do deplatform, and to be honest, I've worked quite a bit with Facebook, for example, in terms of helping to define hateful ideologies, helping to identify groups that should be deplatformed. But they have not gone far enough. I mean, we get this message from them, or from Twitter, or from YouTube, when they've deplatformed a particular group or individual, and we applaud that, and then we wait for several weeks before we hear the next one. And there's still plenty of even just looking at music and music videos, there's still plenty of hateful material that's up there. So part of it is they do have the algorithms to define this, but some of it is passive as well. They wait for us to report these sorts of things. So I think that they need to change their algorithms so that they do identify these sorts of narratives much more quickly, and engage in the takedowns. To the extent that they're slow doing it on their own, perhaps it is time to intervene. But the problem is, right, these are multinationals. It's very challenging. What government is responsible for that? We also need, I think, international frameworks for invoking change and enforcing change on these the social media giants.
I know England started that process a little bit,
Yeah,
but I think we have to bring a little bit more over to this side of the pond as well.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so, so also I wanted to ask, I had another question and it's just left my head. I should have written it down. It was more along the same lines of freedom of speech versus posting something that's hateful on the internet. Can you maybe elaborate between that all mushing together?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked it because it is something that comes up. And many of these far right demonstrations in the last couple of years have framed themselves as free speech demonstrations. On the one hand, they assume a very American, absolutist stance on free speech and freedom of expression, where there are very few restrictions on the freedom of speech. We do have legitimate breaks on speech here, speech that is um, dangerous and harmful, not just offensive, not just hurtful, but language that vilifies. And we have a pretty good, well, not pretty good, we do have a track record of case law that has, for me, quite clearly defined what hate is. And so much of the speech, oversteps those definitions. The Keegstra case is probably the most famous case that sort of restricted or responded to hate speech, and the definitions since then have referred to the vilification, language that renders particular groups liable to hatred, hostility. There was a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that actually identified the 11 hallmarks of hate, which can be used as a sort of heuristic device, if you will, to determine whether something reaches that bar. So we do have tools to use to identify where those lines can be drawn, and they can be drawn. It's not, I don't, it's not as murky to me as it seems to be. Of course, I'm not trained in the law either. So, but yeah, I don't think it's as muddy as all that.
So my last question is as a teacher. So how do we get students that are 17 to 20 years old involved in maybe not fighting back, maybe they don't want to get that involved, but how do we get them more sensitive and maybe interact with this a little bit more than they have been?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that we're all struggling with, in changing our curricula, so that that curricula are, much more focused on, yeah, activity as opposed to passivity. I mean, I've been teaching for how many years now? 3 or 4 years courses where students are developing interventions, online and offline interventions around this sort of issue. And so that's one thing, because when they have ownership of, creating something, when they can be asked to use right, their skills and their technical skills, their graphic skills, their design skills, all of that, right, when they can express themselves, that is often something that's much more appealing to them than us just sitting at the front of the room. So I think that's part of it, is turning the classroom around and giving them responsibility for it. Now, of course, you're going to have those, and universities, we know, are hotspots for some of this resistance and far right activism in particular, and recruitment around the far right. So therein lies the challenge, I think. Although I think the more that's visible, one likes to think that the more likely the majority of the students, are interested in pushing back, right? They don't want their school to be recognized or acknowledged or thought of as, a far right breeding ground. So I think that, yeah, that active component is so important. Even if it's not, even if it's not developing an initiative, is having them actively engaging, and this is always dangerous, right? It's got to be sort of you still got to wrap around them a little bit, sort of looking quite concretely at what is happening online. What is that language? Because we often talk about it in very vague terms, but until they're confronted with it, I think it's something that is a little distant for them. But again, it needs to be done in a very careful way, so that they're not, off in their own little space. So I think that doing it now, where students are, on their computers at home, it's probably less safe to do it now than when you're together in the classroom and you're looking at these collectively, so that you can unpack it, so that they're not just, singly wading through this morass.
Thank you. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for allowing us to think about this a little bit more. I appreciate your time,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I hope to see you soon. Thanks.
Okay, good to be with you again. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Marlene. Bye.